mean, it's been a great month. There's a lot of things to cover, especially there's been certain phenomenal cases, and I think our first speaker is going to talk about that. And we'll start with Jo Bartosch, who really doesn't need any introduction. I'm sure, like me, most of you have seen her name and read a lot of her work. She's assistant editor at the Critic. She's widely published as a journalist and co-author of the upcoming book Pornocracy, which we look forward to as well. And so with that, I'll pass over to her.
So thank you so much for having me. So I was just going to do a bit of a straightforward overview of the Supreme Court ruling in the Four Women and Scottish Ministers case. And I'll touch a little bit on the reaction that's followed as well, which has been insane. So on the 16th of April, the UK Supreme Court clarified the law, and it ruled that the word sex in the Equality Act refers to biological sex, and that obtaining a gender recognition certificate doesn't change that. The wording is absolutely crystal clear. A biological interpretation is necessary for the provisions of the Equality Act to work, and that's, the point of the law. So, and it's very clear that as well, a biological interpretation was found to be necessary for the provisions of the Equality Act to remain coherent. So the response to the 88-page judgment, which was the work of 5 of the most respected British legal brains, has, as I say, just been absolutely insane. There have been trans rights protests across the country. News outlets have been desperately canvassing the opinion of cross-dressing men. There have been sort of claims that it's a descent into Nazism and fascism. It's all been absolutely insane. So the ruling, if I give a bit of background to how the ruling started, it was followed a legal challenge by Four Women Scotland to the Scottish government because they defined woman in the 2018 Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Act to include men with a gender recognition certificate. And they're actually, they make a lot of fuss about how hard they are to get, but they're not. Essentially, you pay £5, you get an online diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and it gets signed off. So, in 2018, the Scottish Parliament passed that law with the stated aim of improving the balance of men and women who sit on the boards of public companies. But the Scottish Government have long been lobbied by trans activist groups. They fund the very groups that they're lobbied by. So obviously, they defined woman to include any man with a gender recognition certificate. So Four Women Scotland, they described this as a Trojan horse. And I think it is fair to say that the Scottish Government knew exactly what they were doing because this was part of a wider pattern. So at the time, they were really pushing to erase sex-based protections. And the former First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, as the case was ongoing, she tried to introduce gender self-identification, as did the person who followed her. Thankfully, that was blocked by Westminster because it's a devolved government in Scotland, so they don't have quite the same powers as the Westminster government. So it was deemed that would have impacted on the whole of the UK, so they had to roll back on that. So that's the sort of backdrop to what was going on as the court was sort of presiding over this. And as I say, they lost the first case. So they won the first case, lost the second one, and then finally won it. So more widely, obviously this is so they won so they won the first case, and that was appealed by the Scottish Government. Then they lost the second, and the ruling for that came from 4 judges, all of whom backed the Scottish Government's position. And I think that really shows how detached the lower courts have become. And there was a really confused ruling from Lady Haldane. So she's a judge in the Court of Session. This is the case that they lost. And she decided that biological sex was, for the purposes of the Equality Act, changed once a gender recognition certificate had been issued. So she dismissed the concerns of lesbian, gay lobby groups, and she suggested that their reasoning of what a gay man and a lesbian was hard to follow. And she claimed that there was no such thing as being legally lesbian. So under that logic, obviously, people would be expected to be sexually orientated to not sex, but those in possession of a gender recognition certificate. And they made quite a lot of that when their case was challenged. So, yeah, the Supreme Court ruling on the 16th just absolutely demolished her analysis, or the analysis of the four lower judges. So they considered evidence from four women in Scotland, obviously, who brought the case, Sex Matters, and then a coalition of groups representing lesbians who are known as the lesbian interveners. And they really sort of made mincemeat of the Scottish Government's case. So basically it reaffirmed, I think crucially, and this is really important, the definition of lesbian. So, woohoo. Then Amnesty International intervened on behalf of the Scottish Government, which is unsurprising given the turn they've taken over recent years, as did the UK Equalities Watchdog, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, so the EHRC. So some people were quite surprised that the EHRC decided to intervene on behalf of the Scottish Government. And it was rejected, but what they said was that the matter ought to go back to Parliament and that it ought to be decided by Parliament. And yeah, thankfully that failed. So the Supreme Court basically found that the Gender Recognition Act remains in effect, but it doesn't override the Equality Act in contexts where doing so would create a legal contradiction, so it would create legal incoherence or contradict the purpose of the Act. So, and that was sort of at the heart of the case, whether the GRA modifies the Equality Act. So it was unanimous, and it was very clear that neither paperwork issued by the state, nor vibes, or the feelings of men, or whatever the hell else altered biological sex. I'm sorry. I hope I'm articulating myself properly. Anyway, so as of the date of the ruling, any organisation that retains a policy that doesn't recognise single-sex spaces, that says that as only being for people of one sex, is potentially authorising unlawful discrimination against its female staff. And the ruling explains that the provisions in the Equality Act allow men to be excluded from women-only spaces and services, and that's because it's considered to be a legitimate aim to protect the privacy, dignity, and safety of women. It also made a point of highlighting that the Equality Act is a consolidating statute. So it brought together, when it was passed 15 years ago now, it brought together the Sex Discrimination Act, the Race Relations Act, and the Disability Act, Discrimination Act, and the Gender Recognition Act. So basically, to avoid falling foul of the law and inviting legal risk, all public and private organisations must now review their policies, their guidance or HR practices that conflate sex with gender identity. And they keep saying biological sex in the court ruling, which is annoying, but I understand why they did. So, notably, people who pretend to be the opposite sex remain protected under the Equality Act because gender reassignment is a protected characteristic. But they also retain protections based on their sex. So the judges were really sort of clear about that. What it means is the rights recognise that for people undergoing so-called gender reassignment or any part of that process, so they didn't create a new legal category of trans men and trans women. They just said essentially if the implication being a woman who identifies as a man, because her sex is now recognised in law, she's protected by maternity discrimination legislation. So actually, it means that so-called trans people have more rights in law, and it's because it recognises their sex. Also, it does make some provision for where it would cause, like, alarm or distress, because obviously testosterone is a very powerful drug. I think its effects are much more pronounced than a man taking estrogen. So where a woman is quite a long way down with her sort of medical transition, whatever, wanting to appear as the opposite sex, where she actually looks like a man, and where she thinks she might cause distress to other women in a women-only service, she can self-exclude. So again, so there's been this gotcha doing the rounds on social media and all the rest of it, which is, well, men can say they're trans men and walk into women's loos. How are you going to tell? Well, to be honest, anyone who looks that much like a man has got the option to go into either a unisex loo or whatever else is available. So anyway, so since the ruling, the EHRC commissioner, Akira Reindorf, so she's been very clear, even though the EHRC did intervene on behalf of the Scottish Government, but she's been very clear, and she told the Times, unless the legislation is changed, the judgment is the final word on the defining question of the debate: what is a woman? The answer, at least in discrimination law, is that a woman is a person who was born female. I mean, there's a bit of me that just thinks it's mad that it's taken 5 judges, however long, to tell us what every toddler and every dog knows, but still, it's there. As the judges stress themselves, statutes should be understandable, they should be constant, they should be predictable, and they should use the ordinary meaning of words. So that means the ordinary understanding of sex is what took precedence. So the Supreme Court's ruling interpretation is binding, and it supersedes any contradictory guidance. Yet, despite the ruling being very clear, many organisations, including the Law Commission, Rape Crisis England and Wales, and even the London Marathon, are now saying they need to wait for EHRC guidance. Now, the EHRC themselves issued a statement saying that they're working on guidance. In the meantime, organisations ought to just interpret the law as it is written and just to get on with it and to stop sort of, waiting for them. Then yesterday, they did release some interim guidance, which essentially says everything that the ruling says. It says, it's very clear. It just says men are men, get over it. So the response, as I say, has been insane. You've had politicians who have really split the Labour Party, which previously was sort of very heavily pushing for gender self-identification, as were the Tories for a while. So the Labour politician who actually drafted the Equality Act, Harriet Harman, who's now a peer, she claimed that it was always what ministers had intended when they were drawing up the legislation, which is interesting, seeing as she didn't say a bloody word when people were being forced out of their workplaces, their social groups, their organisations. She kept totally stum, and now she's apparently saying that it's a matter of that she'd always agreed with it anyway, blah, blah, blah. So obviously we got Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, who pushed Rosie Duffield out of the Labour Party for saying that sex is real and that it matters. And he once said that trans women are women. His office have rolled back on that. He hasn't said it directly himself. He's sort of deferred it to his office, and has said that he supports the ruling, but he hasn't apologised to Duffield or to any of the women who were slandered for years. And there have been some really powerful statements made in Parliament about the work of feminists, actually, which has been heartening. The Liberal Democrats have issued a statement saying that the ruling has caused confusion and worry. So that was Lisa Jardine as their equality spokesperson. But whether it causes confusion or worry or not, they're still going to have to enforce it. I mean, And the Tories have obviously been having quite a lot of fun using it to bash the current administration. So there is talk of a legal challenge. So the Good Law Project, which is basically Jolyon Maugham, he's the barrister who infamously bashed that fox to death whilst wearing his wife's kimono. And he's a tax barrister, so I don't really know why he's got any involvement. Well, I do, but he's trying to do a fundraiser to challenge the ruling. There's been guidance drawn up, I think, by a male barrister who calls himself Robin Moira White, which is like a little card which you hand to people to say, you know, you're infringing my rights as a under the European Convention on Human Rights. You're infringing my rights to use this toilet. If any women are, you know, so have the temerity to challenge him in a loo. Yeah, so the reaction has been insane. But I think finally, the sort of fretting of institutions and their political equivocation and all the rest of it have just been blown out the water by this absolutely clear and unequivocal ruling. So let's just hope all other countries are watching and that it sparks a wider kind of pushback against this abject nonsense which has reduced women to a feeling in porn-addled men's heads. I hope that's clear.
No, it was brilliant. It was a really good presentation. Thank you very much for that
No,
explanation.
you're welcome. You're welcome.